Hi, everybody.
All right, good morning. Mike has already introduced us, and we're very glad to be here this morning. And I'm going to allow my wife to initiate this talk. On.
A culture built on desire. How long have we been married?
20 years this December.
So we've been married for 20 years. Have I ever changed my mind about anything?
All the time.
What should we, have you ever changed your mind about anything? What criteria should it be for us to change our minds?
Well, I can tell you, we look for evidence. We're constantly updating ourselves with knowledge, with reason, engage our minds, and then we conclude that maybe what we know, it's not exactly part of the whole truth, so we keep seeking.
So we keep looking for truth, and what we believe today, what we are going to share today, might not be exactly true. That's always a risk when you get up in front and you talk. Maybe it's not exactly true, and maybe some of you don't agree with what we're saying, and that's okay. We have friends that don't agree with us, but we have to point towards the truth. We have to say what we believe, say what we think is true to the best of our knowledge, and be open to more evidence.
Always. And you know, we don't come from a dogmatic corner. We don't come from a place that we know what's best. We humbly come as truth seekers. We want you to know that. Who knows, down the line, we may unlearn some things and learn the evidence tells us otherwise. We're open to that. The one truth we know is found in our Creator. And we hope to keep going there.
So desire is the highest law in our culture. That's one of the things that that's a thesis of our talk today. Our culture is breeding mental illness. So we have more mental illness than ever, and we're going to say a few things why we think that is.
So we're going to talk about 4 values. There are 4 values of our culture of desire, and these are pride, passion, pleasure, and power. The pride, under satanic influence, can manifest in isolation. If I'm proud and I know better than you, and I am better than anyone else, chances are I'll become isolated. But God can use this and we can become submission. We can attain submission. Under God's design by working through our minds. How about passion? Passion leads to anger and despair, but under God's influence, it can be manifested into patience. Pleasure, you know that constant seeking of pleasure leads to what? To addiction, because we will never be satisfied. However, God can use this to submit this pleasure to His control in what He has given us and attain trust and connection, the opposite of isolation, right? About power. Power under the devil is used for coercion, under self is used for manipulation. How many of you have manipulated or ever? You say, no, I don't want to. And that is the right answer. I will not want to do that. But power can be used by God to persuade our hearts. Doesn't He persuade us? He doesn't say, this is the way or else. But He uses the truth to persuade us. So these 4 aspects and values of our current culture can be used for good and evil. We're going to talk about this. We're going to unpack this in the light of us as a creation in our brain processes. So in the postmodern culture, as we know, truth is a trigger word, right? Because as Michael was pointing out, well, what is truth really? And so is it your truth, my truth, our collective truth? So there's a standpoint or epistemology aspects about this. No, there's no objective truth. Truth does not exist as a one truth or the truth. Truth claims are only verified by powerful or the enlightened or the professionals, etc., etc., etc. Authorities, you know what I mean? That is the tendency in our current times. Now, I must say that in order to have trust, faith in God, you must have the standards of truth. But that is difficult to attain if we do not dedicate ourselves to that seeking constantly. The Bible, trust requires truth. Isn't that okay? It is evident that faith requires truth as well. Those principles are there for a reason, but we need to be convinced, and that is a challenge. Through this process that we know, the process is in the brain. The Bible from Genesis to Revelation is revealing that there's truth about God. Have you realized that many people seeking for truth arrive to different truth? There's something wrong there. But there's a process in our brains that we must engage. We're going to talk about that too.
How has it come that Western civilization and our culture has come to the place where we not only think that it is okay to mutilate the genitals and sterilize children, making them lifelong medical patients, but as a collective, we think that it's morally wrong not to do this? That is what our institutions, our medical institutions, have come under this spell, that they believe it's wrong not to do what is so obviously wrong. The medical ethic has always been grounded in do no harm. Any medical intervention in the past, the standard is there has to be a benefit, and the benefits have to outweigh the risk, because every medical intervention that you do has risks. You make an intervention, it has risks. It can go wrong. So we have to know that the benefits are worth the risk to do a medical intervention. If you really want to understand this topic more in detail, there's several books that you can read. Irreversible Damage, You're Teaching My Child What, by Dr. Miriam Grossman. She's a child and adolescent psychiatrist. Lost in Translation is another good book to read, and The Queering of the American Child. So we really, you need to study these out. There has been medical scandals in the past. Think eugenics, think lobotomies, multiple personality disorder. There's been many medical scandals in the past. And it takes people seeking for truth to really understand, what is truth and look for the truth rather than ideology. Who is more susceptible to ideology? More susceptible to in-group bias. Our brains are susceptible to delusion. Our brains are susceptible to groupthink and to self-delusion. Who's more susceptible to in-group bias?
I would say us, professionals, people that have experience in the clinical and scientific realm.
So very smart people are adept at coming up with good reasons for bad ideas.
Now, in ancient times, we want to transport you to what the common belief was in the societies. They sacrificed young children and young warriors. They had to be young, usually virgins. Here's two cultures, the Inca Empire. They used to have these elaborate ceremonies, and you see these young ladies there. It was considered an honor for a family to offer their children in sacrifice. We have the Aztecs down below in the picture, where they had basically a killing orgy for the enemy, and they selected the good-looking young men warriors, the strongest, to be sacrificed to appease the gods. Imagine that this cultures were practicing those sacrifices. Are we practicing similar attitudes towards children these days? I just leave the question there. We want to continue to unpack this knowledge in the light of the seeking for truth processes that we can exercise through God's help. It is a law both of the intellectual and the spiritual nature that by beholding we become changed. Everything we do, thought, actions, behaviors, by practicing them, our minds become changed towards that which we are beholding. The mind gradually adapts itself to the subjects upon which it is allowed to dwell. Now, powerful. It becomes assimilated to that which it is accustomed to love and to reverence. Man will never rise higher than the standard of purity or goodness or truth. Here's the word truth. Which truth are we talking about? If self is the loftiest ideal, he will never attain to anything more exalted. Rather, he will constantly sink lower and lower. The grace of God alone has power to exalt man. Left to himself, his course must be inevitably downward.
So this comes from the chapter in Great Controversy, chapter 34. It's on spiritualism. And what we are experiencing today in this world, this movement that is happening, I realized after studying this chapter, I read it every day for 30 days before another talk that I gave. And this chapter is fulfilled right now in our day, if you really read it and understand. And we're going to talk about the mirror neurons, because by beholding, we are changed.
So the mirror neurons are part of pathways that allow us to become empathic. It is the fabric, the framework by which God has created mammals. So here we have, I'm going to show you this experiment. I don't think I can point out to here, but in the top figure, we see the demo animal term, and most of the studies have been done in laboratory rats because there is a strain. Actually, this figure depicts one of the most used animals, the Western rat, which is very smart. It's also a good-looking rat. So people that study them become very attached to them because they're so smart. Their eyes sparkle anyway. But we have their demo rat being shocked by an external source through glass dividing the two cages. The cages are not illustrated, but we see the observer rat is starting to get uneasy. Look at the curve of the mirror neuron activation there for both. So the pink is the observer and the blue is the animal being stressed. And so the animal that is observing starts to get uneasy. It's as if that animal is experiencing the distress that this other rat is getting. Another study, which is self-nociception, tried to vary this activity of the mirror neurons by having a rat on the observer now become, it had to activate a lever and getting shocked to himself, thinking that, oh, I need to get some food, and it was just activating the lever for a shock. The demo became now a mirror that, but look at the demo rat, the mirror neurons were firing at a greater magnitude, thinking, I need to help. I mean, we can interpret it as I need to help type of behavior, but it couldn't do anything. And amazing in these animals. And the third is a prosocial helping. Here's a restrained animal. The restrained animal in that too is very uncomfortable to be there for an animal with a long tail, right? And it's not, animals want to roam free. And the observer animal, after a few seconds, it starts to try to help this other rat that is restrained. And look at the mirror neurons. Now, I wanted to point out in the second graph, I didn't point out that the anti-mirror neurons cause the rat that was observing to just watch, and it's kind of an inhibitory mechanism. Well, this rat is doing it to himself. Maybe I better stay quiet. Isn't that amazing? So the people experimented, the scientists were interpreting this as something going on in the minds of the rats. They coupled this with MRI studies later. We're not going to talk about that. So there's two populations, the mirror neurons and the anti-mirror neurons, which have to out-regulate each other for the appropriate response. That's the bottom line here. And so, and the last, down at the bottom, that animal is trying to liberate. Now it starts to exert actions. That means that the mirror neurons won over the anti-mirror neurons, and now it wants to help. So, the bottom line here is this. Every time we watch something, we read something, our brains start to fire as if we were engaging in those things we are reading and watching. Isn't that powerful? This is the mechanism, the mirror neurons. So I want to read you something from the same chapter.
That's the same.
That is the same. But I want to highlight, I want to take it to, in itself is the oldest, itself, is the loftiest ideal. What would happen to us? That person will never attain what is looking for and constantly seeking lower. We're going to unpack this mechanism with the neuroscience in a little bit. But isn't something. In other words, I'm going to set this scenario where the brain is susceptible. And we think, wait a minute, hasn't God created us? What's happening that we have these susceptibilities? We'll let you know in a minute. Now, this idolatry of self has been explored by Carl Trueman. He studied the history of philosophy through our postmodern era. And he concluded that there's a cultural amnesia that forgets what has been shown before. Expressive individualism and the road to towards the road of sexual revolution, meaning that it doesn't matter what has happened through time, that's what we're heading, where it's about myself, how I feel, forget about everybody else. Now, if we read Romans 1:22 and 25, Paul could have forecasted this. He says, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth, again, here's the word, the truth, about God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature, in this case, oneself, rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And how powerful. It was right there in the Bible. But Paul was talking to people in his time as well. So think about it. From creation, our minds have been susceptible to these very same mechanisms. And the devil has captured those mechanisms to turn the attention away from our Creator into ourselves. And that's something. To complete his work, he declares through the Spirit that true knowledge places man above all law, that whatever it is right, that God does not condemn, and that all sins which are committed are innocent. When people are thus led to believe that desire, are we in a culture of desire, is the highest law, that liberty is licensed, and that man is accountable only to himself. Who can wonder that corruption and depravity teem on every hand? Multitudes eagerly accept teachings that leave them at liberty to obey the promptings of the carnal heart. The reins of self-control are laid upon the neck of lust. The powers of mind and soul are made subjects to the animal propensities. And Satan exultingly sweeps into his net thousands who profess to be followers of Christ. This is happening in our churches too.
It is what it is. Whatever is right. Isn't that what everyone says? It is what it is.
Indeed.
Freud pointed out, his thesis was that sexual boundaries, unconscious desires, are the cause of mental illness. He thought that this was true. He thought that man is an animal. Animals copulate whenever they feel like it. So man can't do that because man is in civilization. So therefore, this conflict between what you want to do and what you can do, your superego is in conflict with your id, and therefore you have mental illness. Now, Freud was wrong based on the evidence of today. We have taken down most sexual boundaries, and do we have less mental illness? We don't have less mental illness taking down sexual boundaries. Sexual boundaries are necessary for civilization. He pointed this out in Civilization and its discontents. But sex outside of boundaries is dangerous. God has given us a brain with all the complexities to reason and to communicate with Him. Exploring the amazing fact of this organ is looking at all the connectivity in the brain. Your brain gives you feelings, emotions, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, all come from the brain. You have 86 billion neurons in your brain. Each of those neurons has about 10,000 connections. So it's from that complexity that your mind comes to be. A thought, a feeling, a behavior is a connection of neurons in your brain. The brain is the most complex thing known to science. It is by far the most complex thing. And each time we have a thought and a feeling and a behavior, we change our brain. So at the end of this lecture, your brain will be different than it was at the beginning of the lecture. Because if that weren't true, you'd go away from this meeting and you would not remember anything that was spoken here today. So we change our brains constantly based on our experience, based on what we think about, based on what we do. Even a secular psychiatrist, Dr. Lemke, suggested that our nation is a dopamine nation. It's a pleasure nation. We are constantly overstimulating the dopamine receptors. There's many examples of this: amusement, drinking, drugs, videos, social media. There's many examples of overstimulation, hyper-novelty that is exciting the neurons. And drugs also, anything of addiction, gambling, anything that is addictive goes into the reward center in the brain, and it increases dopamine. So we're going to talk about how overstimulating dopamine, basically what it does to the brain.
So basically, what it is here's the mechanism that we wanted to present to you, known as neuronal adaptation. So think about that word. The neurons are adapting to a new high. But what happens in this cell? So here we're illustrating a dopamine neuron. So there's a neuron, the dopamine neuron, which needs to be regulated. Every pathway in the brain, it's regulated. There's a regulatory neuron that has neurotransmitters to inhibit that dopamine neuron so it doesn't release a lot of the dopamine needed, so it regulates it, right? That's what regulation means in physiology. Now, you see those barrels there on the dopamine neuron? Those are the receptors. Those are proteins known as receptors or channels that receive the input in the message. It's a neurochemical message from the regulatory neuron. So there's that connection. Now, there's a receiving end, the sensory or perceptive neuron in those pathways. And those neurons have also proteins. There they are, ready to receive that input from these neurotransmitters. And we see them in a healthy number. That number of 6 neurotransmitter vesicles containing the chemical there in 6 proteins just happens to be a correlation for the illustration purposes. It's quite similar in their amount of neurotransmitter and the amount of proteins. Okay, so this is just for illustration purposes. What happens when this dopamine neuron begins to secrete, that pathways gets activated and begins to secrete that neurotransmitter over and over again? The cell, the system will protect itself by retrieving those proteins, taking them out because it says, wait, what are you doing to me? You are producing neurotoxicity, which means that the neurochemicals are floating there in that synapse. So now we have less receptor proteins to interact. What happens with the individual? Now it goes to higher activities. If one activity is not, exacerbate activities, that is, if it's not obtaining the same reward, it scales up. More thrills, more novelty, more cruelty, more sadism, etc., etc. You see where I'm going with that? To get the same effect. In other words, more stimulation to get the same reward. Neuronal adaptation is the mechanism that our brain has, and it's susceptible to that.
It's a protective mechanism that God put to protect the neuron from dying.
Exactly.
And this is a graph from The Pleasure Trap, which is a good book to read also. It's showing the normal pleasure zone. So it can be applied, in this book it's applied to food, it can be applied to video games, every area that is hyper novelty, hyper stimulating. So what happens, you're in the normal pleasure zone, and normal pleasure, God created that. Because when you do a job well done, when you go to work and do your job, you get a reward in your brain. Dopamine rewards you for that job well done. So normal pleasure, normal, relationships, all of that stimulates the normal pleasure zone. Going for a walk in nature, for example, you get that normal stimulation. That's not bad, right? But when you go into the hyper pleasure zone, hyper palatable foods, hyper entertainment, that puts you in the enhanced pleasure zone. So then when you go down and you eat normal foods, or you eat, whole foods, or you eat, have normal pleasure promoting situations, it feels like low pleasure. So you're seeking pleasure just because you're of the neural adaptation. It doesn't feel like enhanced pleasure anymore. The enhanced pleasure feels like normal pleasure. And so the normal pleasure feels like low pleasure. You see what I mean? So that's where we're going to talk about here a little bit about the sexual pleasure and how that wires the brain.
Indeed, the young brain is susceptible. And this, again, has been done in laboratory rats in the context, very Pavlovian. If you guys remember the Russian scientist with Pavlov, that contextualized response. I want to read you something from a review that came out. A critical period exists during an individual's early sexual experience that creates a love map or gestalt of features, movements, feelings, and interpersonal interactions associated with sexual reward. Here's that novelty sitting in a brain that is not capable. I'm going to take we're going to talk about here that what we're talking about is the young brain, the brain that is not fully matured. It is susceptible to those contexts, right? It has not attained the prefrontal cortex is not mature yet. And so it cannot go in a full loop to make sense of what's going on. And so the early physical attachments and sexual experiences, what are they doing to that brain? Are contextualizing for a mechanical response into something. This was demonstrated as the basis of reward directly to this pathway. As you see on the bottom, the endogenous opioid dopamine activation. Those two systems, opioids, sound familiar? Those are the reward, calming, and painkiller effect that the brain has. It's an autoprotective, as Rhoda pointed out, mechanism that is not abused. Now, you see the rats there in number 1. That is the normal context of mating. So there's a female, the darker animal there in the illustration. It's put in a cage in a context, and when that female is in a heat period, an estrus, A male comes in and they measure its release of dopamine in normal curves. That is the context. So that's the normal context. However, when they put that same female in that context, that female expected something. And this is a young rat, by the way. And so that female, and you know how they activated the dopamine reward system? They measured it. They also activated it with optogenetics, which is a complex mechanism that neuroscience has been studied to artificially activate this pathway, these neurons. Can you believe that? Without neurotransmitters. Anyway, the take-home message here is that that context of that young rat was already assuming the sexual position by being in that place, being so young before it was fully mature. And so they studied the brain, and there was dopamine release already. So that context. And we want to translate this into the young minds. And so tell us something about that brain anatomy and function.
I was just going to add one little thing on there, because I think, your first sexual experience, no matter your age, does wire those areas of the brain.
That's true.
Right? To the reward center. So so that's the love map situation.
Correct?
Yeah. I was just adding that. So high emotions wire the brain neurons more tightly. Fear, danger, excitement wire neurons more potently. The child's brain forms based on what it's exposed to. Your brain will be different. I already mentioned this. The frontal lobe plans, organizes, and dampens down strong emotions. In children, the frontal lobe is the last to develop. So in your mid-20s is when your frontal lobe is fully developed into your mid-20s. So children exposed to high emotion and high sexual content can't suppress those strong emotions, can't suppress those, dopamine responses because they don't have a fully functioning frontal lobe.
So it is widely accepted that the use-dependent brain plasticity consists in the repetition of physical actions or sensory and auditory processing. That conclusion, brain plasticity. How many of you have heard of brain plasticity or neuroplasticity? Yeah, I kind of introduced that concept yesterday. So we have been talking about the mechanism of the reward pathways and how sin has hijacked these pathways. Guess what? God is using these pathways for healing as well. And the mechanism is neuroplasticity. Oh, aren't we excited? So we're not all lost. And I'm going to read you this further. Repeated practice of a behavior is crucial for brain changes, whether it's for good or for evil. Merely learning a behavior will not cause a significant change in its neuroanatomy. Neuroanatomy, meaning the actual cytoarchitecture, the actual neuronal change in what follows in its chemical interactions, such as neurotransmitter with the protein that I told you in neuronal adaptation. So in other words, you must rehearse that which you are learning. Does it make sense? If I want to unlearn a behavior, if I want to leave a behavior, should I practice it more or should I walk away from it? Right? So there's a role for us, and Rhoda will tell you how to restore that by mentioning a few things, a few strategies that can promote neuroplasticity. Now, the mechanisms underlying this effect may involve the Hebbian learning. Hebbian, this is the fellow there, Hebbs, which started this thought of neurons that wired together, the strengthening of the pathways. So when you have that synapsis, and that is practiced, it is strengthened. If you leave that behavior, that thought, that visual activity, or that thing that you're watching that constantly, you leave it, chances are your brain starts to disconnect. Those pathways become weakened, and that's something. Right now, here's the mechanism for those of you. This is the physiology that we're amazed with. And I have engaged in some studies with some subjects in terms of learning that we want to arrive to measuring neuroplasticity markers, which is very challenging in humans, but it can be done. So here's how there's neuroplasticity. Here's how this happens. There's 3 types of changes. One is the structural changes, the change of actual neurons. Here's the dendrites illustrated there. The formation of dendritic spines, meaning there's extensions from the dendrites that are receivers for input. Those change. Some terminals get denser, some are pruned out, or pruned down rather, so that they are not as activated as before. And that is a response to this self-regulation of the pathway, this fine-tuning of the pathway. Then the second is a functional change that consists in neurochemical release, which are your neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitter concentration or production of these chemicals is fine-tuned accordingly to follow these changes, right? That makes sense. And then the molecular events cause the proteins to be put in there. So you see those 2 little barrels, or those are the proteins and channels that we talked about, right? Now, let's illustrate these 3 changes into the synapse. Here's what happens. So, and the first one, we have the normal synapse change. We have the presynaptic and the postsynaptic, and you see there the calcium ion, which is those molecules right there flooding the brain, that calcium going into the postsynaptic brain. So calcium is the activator. That means that repeated, and if we're learning something, repeated stimulation causes this calcium to activate the insertion of more proteins. You see the AMPA receptors put in before there weren't any. We're learning something that is known as long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation meaning learning to stay in that activity for the longer haul. The language we have learned, the skills. Some of us can play instruments. Some of us can sing. Some of us can acquire. We ride bikes. So those have been learned for a long term, right? And so calcium, there's a molecule, the neurotransmitter that causes more receptors to be activated. On the opposite hand, if we, like I said, stop doing something, or have you forgotten how to do certain activities over time if you don't practice them, right? So you lose it if you don't use it, right? That same calcium, this is the magic thing. God is so intelligent. The same ion, the same chemical, if that pathway is not exercised, activates what? Cellular regulatory responses that retract those other additional proteins that were there and puts them inside the cell. I don't need it anymore. So there it is. Isn't it something? Everything is built in there for good and regulatory processes. So tell us about some of the strategies that we can do to cause this to fine-tune and take us away from deleterious and self-deprecating behaviors.
So we talk about dopamine fasting. When you want to reset your dopamine to normal reward. And fasting can be fasting from social media, fasting from media, fasting from food, fasting from high stimulatory activities. But this, going out in nature, camping, this helps reset the brain. Regular exercise promotes neuroplasticity. Practicing prayer, and we have research articles for each area. My husband has done some research in some of these areas as well. It's all about the dopamine regulation, and balanced diet also helps restore neuroplasticity, increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So all of these ways God has given us to help heal the brain and promote mental health. So these are the remedies not only for physical health, but for mental health.
And by the way, we have put the references there because these are areas where the publication is very widespread. Now, there are other types of benefits, such as one of them is what?
Sunshine.
Sunshine.
Sunshine helps every cell in your body. There's something called near-infrared radiation, which our friend at MedCram. He has a whole lecture on that. If you look up MedCram on near-infrared radiation, every cell in your body, the mitochondria in the cell is affected by the near-infrared radiation. So God has given us natural healing for the brain, including your brain cells, as well as the body.
And by the way, the mitochondrial is the powerhouse, right? It's the one that regulates our energy. And so all of it is there. And science is now identifying these benefits. That's where we put the references, because these are the areas that have been studied now. And, have accelerated in the last 5 to 10 years. And so I've done some of the studies, especially when it comes to balance diet and dopamine regulation. We put dopamine regulation as a balance with another neurotransmitter known as serotonin, because serotonin decreases when dopamine increases. After all, they have the similar biochemical pathways. And so you cannot just decrease dopamine without fine-tuning the serotonin and other neurotransmitters. So the brain is complex. Didn't we say that at the beginning? So if you diminish one or increment one neurotransmitter, the other ones follow. And that is the trick here.
Roughly, you say dopamine, pleasure, serotonin, happiness. Right? So when we drive up the dopamine with all this extra stimulation, you're actually driving down your happiness.
And that's what happens, yes.
So.
And so that illustrates this. Well, I want to read you, we always correlate with with what we find in the Bible, because the Bible, we can find neuroscience in the Bible. Did you know that? Well, let's go there, because we have something amazing here to share with you. And the Desire of Ages points to this episode of Jesus' encounter with Mary Magdalene. Mary had been looked upon as a great sinner, but Christ knew the circumstances that had shaped her life. He might have extinguished every spark of hope in her soul, but he did not. It was he who had lifted her from despair and ruin. 7 times she had heard his rebuke of the demons that control her heart and mind. She had heard his strong cries to the Father in her behalf. She knew how offensive is sin to his unsullied purity. And in his strength she had overcome. This is a description of what the process that took place in Mary's, we call it Mary's heart. Well, that's the brain. Not only in its neuronal connections, but in its pathways, in what it resulted in a wonderful. 7 times. I was talking to Rhoda before the presentation. We don't know the mechanism. One time we want to ask God, Lord, how does the demons possess one's mind, and how do you kick them out of a person? When it says 7 times, does it mean that you have neuroplasticity 7 times around for each process, or they're all how does it happen? But here it is. Isn't that amazing? Mm-hmm. So Rhoda got inspired and came up with a poem that is going to share with you right now.
We want our brains to continue to move towards the truth of God's reality. Here we uphold seeking the truth in the context of theory versus reality. So when I'm thinking of theory, evolutionary theory, gender theory, queer theory, theory versus reality. Theory says you should change your body to fit your mind. Jesus says he created your body and your mind, you and body and mind. Theory says it's bigoted to want to heal people like you. Actually, queer theories, that's part of queer theory. You can't heal people because that's a bigoted act. It makes the normal people, it's biased against handicapped people. Believe it or not, if you read David Halperin, if you read Judith Butler, that's what they say. Jesus says his healing love is for everyone, including you. Theory says your identity is a member of a group collective. Jesus says your identity is in him. Theory says desire is the highest law. Jesus says he has an overwhelming, unquenchable desire for you. Theory promises things it can never deliver. Jesus' promises are more than you could ever dream of.
Amen.
Theory tells you to perform. Jesus offers you rest. And we forgot to mention rest. Theory has no future, only death. Jesus is knocking at the door of your heart, and if you let him in, he'll give you eternal life.
Amen. So it's very touching. She and inspired by the Holy Spirit, we want to share this with you. Our message is not only about the physiology, the wonderful creation of the brain, but it's about the power of transformation of that brain for a behavior based on truth. And we continue to explore. We're not going to stop. We don't have all the knowledge. Someday, our Creator will reveal it to us. So we want to leave you with this thought. Later, didn't investigate the circumstances, but this is a powerful phrase that was written to James White by Ellen G. White. Every expression of doubt strengthens unbelief. Isn't it true? What you believe takes a hold of your mind. Every thought and word of hope, courage, light, and love strengthens faith and fortifies the soul to withstand the moral darkness that exists in the world. Those who talk faith will have faith, and those who talk discouragement will have discouragement. By beholding, we become changed. I hope that this message, founded in evidence, creates in you the yearning to seek for the truth by engaging fully every process and every pathway of your brains. Amen.